let's move on. Our next speaker is Jim Matheson, Chief Executive Officer of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. We're really pleased to have Jim with us. For those of you in our international audience, NRECA represents rural electric cooperatives. A large portion of our country is supplied by his members, and it's a pleasure to have you here, Jim, and I look forward to hearing about what the state of play is in the cooperative sector. I'll turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you. It's really good to be here. I always enjoy listening to my colleagues when they make their presentations as well, and I attempt not to do too much redundancy for my friend Tom Kuhn, but he stated well a lot of the factors associated with the electric sector today. As you mentioned, the electric co-ops serve a lot of the landmass of this country. We serve, in some ways, the hardest to serve and most expensive to serve areas of this country. Sparsely populated areas, a lot of infrastructure to meet, not many meters in that area. We serve 42 million people in this country, about 1 in 8 Americans. And the other key thing to mention about electric cooperatives that I always like to start any remarks with is that we have this unique business structure where we are actually consumer owned. We're owned by the consumers and the communities that we serve. That affects everything we do from an operational standpoint at the individual electric co-op to the programming that the National Trade Association does for those members to the political advocacy that we do. It's all based on looking at it through the eyes of that consumer. And it's a really important North Star for us in everything that we do. I have to say, I've had the opportunity to see a lot of our members in person over the last few months, and we try to listen to our members and learn from them about what's going on. And it's been really helpful. I love that collaboration opportunity to connect with them. I'm sure many of my colleagues participating in this program today would say the same thing about how much they enjoy that feedback from their members. There's some interesting trends I've heard from in no particular order. One of them is the supply chain issue. We hear about supply chain for all sectors of the economy. We're not unique. The electric sector is feeling it too. And there are some serious disruptions and delays and some significant cost impacts for just basic materials that it takes to run an electric utility. And that's not unique to electric co-ops. The whole sector is facing this. We've communicated those concerns to the White House to make sure there's an understanding as they look at the supply chain issue in general, that the electric sector is a pretty important component of that. If the lights aren't on, that's a real problem for the rest of the economy. We all know that, but sometimes it's good to remind people of that. The supply chain issues are real. We're working through them, but that's something I've heard a lot from our members. The second issue I've heard a lot about are our workforce issues. We're in this circumstance. We've heard about the term, the Great Resignation. It's a tight labor pool out there, and those line workers that have remarkably important and challenging jobs, they're at a premium out there in the marketplace. And I think it's important that we collectively, as the energy sector, always are looking for ways to keep the pipeline going in terms of building that workforce. We are doing that in a coordinated way, but I'm just telling you that those workforce issues that everyone reads about across the economy, they affect our sector as well. Third issue that I hear a lot from my members is concern about reliability. You know, we're all about reliability on the electric side, and there has been some concern, particularly with weather events, about reliability of natural gas supplies. And I've heard a lot from our members about just raising that as an issue in terms of availability and reliability of that supply particularly during these cold weather circumstances that we've experienced in the past year. Finally, I hear from our members, as I always do, about their concern about the term that everyone in the energy sector says, right? Reliability and affordability. We really mean that and take it to heart in the electric co-op world and as a national association. We serve 92% of the persistent poverty counties in America. So that poverty number tells you that affordability really is significant for us, and it drives a lot of our decision making and our policy advocacy, as I said. I also heard from our members about just how much change they're facing. You've heard that from the previous speakers as well. There's so much that's driving change in the energy sector, but particularly in the electric sector. A lot of drivers have changed. Technology is rapidly evolving and creating new choices, new opportunities. Markets are evolving. Organized markets are evolving, changing the way this industry runs. And technology changes create consumer expectations that are market-driven expectations as well. And finally, there's the policy world, which always has an impact in terms of how our sector is regulated, how it's run. Policy generally tends to lag behind market and technology changes, but it's there. And all of those factors are really affecting change in our sector in a way that our members feel it, they talk about it. And again, it's something that we really try to focus on as the National Association. I've mentioned the word reliability a few times already, and I have to say that really is an important factor that we look at. And I want to talk about it in the context of the policy world, because we're going through all these changes with technology and markets, and the policy world's trying to keep up with all that. And as they are looking at those issues and trying to adapt or evolve public policy, reliability needs to be a primary concern in terms of the design of that new policy. And I'm not so sure that's always the case. That's why we talk about it all the time when we meet with policymakers. I mean, if you're going to shift to significant electrification of the economy, as Tom Kuhn talked about earlier, transportation sector and beyond, that creates a number of operational challenges that can be overcome, but let's make sure when we're designing the policies that affect that, that we're not putting the reliability of the electric system at risk. Because as important as the electric grid is to our economy today, if we electrify more of our economy in the future, it's just all the more important. And so we really want to make sure that policy discussion, that reliability is always a cornerstone of formulating policy in the public policy world. I have to say that it's also important during these transitions to recognize the need for always available dispatchable power. That's what really is another cornerstone of reliability. And it's important that we seek out and preserve, and I recognize the value of baseload resources. There is a significant investment being made in resources that aren't baseload, and that's fine as part of the portfolio. But again, system reliability matters, and we want to make sure we understand the important components of that portfolio and how they all contribute to reliability. So I've talked about sort of generically how we want public policy to think about reliability, but let's talk specifically about some of the policy issues in play right now in Washington. The first, of course, is the infrastructure bill that passed last year. You've heard reference to it. What a significant bill. There are 27 different separate funding opportunities in that bill that electric cooperatives can engage with. They range from grid investments and cybersecurity and clean energy to broadband, which is really an important issue for rural electric cooperatives, even though it's not an electricity issue. Since we're community owned and the consumers own those co-ops and they don't have access to good broadband in rural America, we've gotten in that business as well. And so that infrastructure bill is significant. We spent a lot of time and effort making sure the electric cooperative perspectives were understood in the development of that bill. Of course, now we're in a stage where many of the federal agencies who will be tasked with implementing those programs are developing their rules for that right now. And we're at the table making sure, again, that the electric cooperative perspective is understood as those programs are designed in greater detail. Other issue that's big that is still in play, and again, I know Tom Kuhn mentioned it, was the broader budget reconciliation package. Is a significant bill in terms of its depth and breadth. A couple issues that are really important to us in the electric co-op world. One is the concept, we call it direct pay. Let me set the table here. For years, Congress has used tax credits as a means to incent investment in new energy technologies, primarily over the last several years in the renewable space with wind and solar. We're non-for-profit entities owned by the consumers, so those tax credits have no value to electric cooperatives. So electric cooperatives do not have that incentive directly put in front of them in terms of making that type of investment. we've raised that issue, not just for renewables, but for all energy technology with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And we've reached a pretty good consensus in both parties that there's a step we could take that would incent folks who do not have taxable status to also make those investments. And that's not limited to the electric cooperatives. The municipals, and Joy is going to speak after me, have the same situation. They're in the same situation we're in. So there's a provision that's been developed, and it's part of the draft reconciliation bill that is called direct pay, where the Treasury Department would in fact have a direct payment to non-taxable entities when they make the similar investments as the equivalent of what the tax credit would be. And it's for all energy technology. So it can be for renewables. It can be for carbon capture sequestration tax credits. It could be, I suspect, electric vehicle infrastructure. There's going to be a tax credit incentive. And in the future, there could very well be tax credit incentives to invest in storage. And we think it's important that the entire electric sector have access to that same level of incentives to invest in those types of assets in new and emerging technologies. That's a really important issue for the electric cooperatives. It would be transformative for our sector. Again, I'm pleased to say that folks on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill think it's a good idea. We're just looking for a vehicle where it could pass Congress, and we all know that in the current environment, not much legislation moves through Congress. But if there's a tax related bill that moves through Congress, we're going to be really aggressive about having that direct pay component being part of that legislation. Let me mention one other electric cooperative policy priority in front of Congress right now. We have the ability as electric cooperatives to have financing through the Department of Agriculture, and specifically the Rural Utility Service, which is within the Department of Agriculture. And it's interesting. It's a good rate, a reasonable interest rate, but we're locked in. And if we want to refinance our debt with the Rural Utility Service, the contracts as they're written now, when we take out loans from the Rural Utility Service, have a prepayment penalty, and the prepayment penalty wipes out any economic gain of refinancing at lower interest rates. So we've gone through this period in America with these historically low interest rates, and so much of our economy has had the benefit of participants, different businesses being able to refinance and enjoy the benefits of that lower cost of capital. We've been unable to do that. And so we've again gone to Congress and put this issue in front of them about the need, because it's going to take an act of Congress to get rid of these prepayment penalties. And I'm pleased to say again that bipartisan Democrats, Republicans agree this is a good thing to do. I haven't met anyone in Congress on either side of the aisle who opposes this concept of moving a bill that would eliminate the prepayment penalties for debt with the Rural Utility Service. So that all sounds great, but it's tough to bring it up for a vote. And we're looking for a vehicle again that would allow that piece of legislation to pass. But again, what a big step for rural America if that bill passes. Because again, I've said it many times, our electric cooperatives are owned by the communities they serve. So if that community is able to refinance that debt at a lower rate, all the benefit, 100% of it, goes straight to the consumer, because we're consumer-owned utilities. So I just want to mention those are some of our big policy priorities in Washington that we're emphasizing. They're consistent with my opening comments about we're all about reliability and affordability, and it should come as no surprise when you hear about those priorities that they really fit that structure about what we'd like to see in our industry. I guess to close my prepared remarks before we take questions, you've heard from the previous speakers, and you're going to hear from me. There's a lot going on in our sector right now. There's a lot of change going on, and that's exciting, and it creates a lot of interesting challenges, but also some really interesting opportunities. A lot of the change is really being driven down from the traditional old school central station power vertically integrated sector into more of a distributed energy resource sector in terms of technology, putting more power and decision making in the hands of the consumer. Consumer can decide if they want to put panels on their roof. The consumer can decide if they want to have a programmable energy management system within their home. The consumer can decide if they want to have an electric vehicle, and the consumer can decide when they want to charge that vehicle. And the consumer's been given a lot of these new decisions that they have, and how we can best harmonize those decisions with the value for the community really matters. And so, electric cooperatives were started 80 years ago. And at the time, they weren't started because we were thinking about these technology and decision-driven consumer expectations and decisions that I'm mentioning now. But my gosh, we are so well structured with our business model to really realize the opportunities that these technology changes are creating in our sector. So this is a really exciting time for electric cooperatives. We think our consumer-owned model gives us the ability to realize so much value from these changes. This is a sector that perhaps for several decades didn't have a lot of change. There's a lot going on right now. It's a really fun time to be in the electric sector, and it's a great time to be involved with the electric cooperatives. So with that, Will, those are the comments I want to make before I go to questions, but I'm happy to answer anything you may want to ask of me.
Jim, thanks so much for a really comprehensive discussion on what the electric cooperatives are thinking about these days. Everything from workforce retention to supply chain to tax policy, really comprehensive. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. How do we incentivize and retain at workforce and incentivize our young people to come into the industry and take these good paying, sustainable jobs that are being offered that are not only sustainable in terms of being able to provide for a family, but for the community, the need to sustain the community. How do we do that?
Well, you've certainly stated the framework in which we ought to describe these jobs. There's no question. While these can be physically challenging jobs, and they're also very well-paid jobs. They're mission-driven jobs where you're really helping the community and keeping the lights on. And we find for the line workers that work in the co-op world, that's really a big factor in them pursuing that as their career. I do think as an energy sector, we have kind of a fragmented approach, quite candidly, in terms of how we create our training programs or apprenticeship programs. It's very localized, which at one level local's good, don't get me wrong, but we could probably take a more comprehensive view across the trades about how we do this. Now, we do have an organization that I think many of the participants on this program participate in, the Center for Energy Workforce Development. And I think that's an interesting platform for us to talk about ways we can have a more coordinated, consolidated effort to really, if nothing else, this sounds kind of simple, get the word out about the value of these jobs. Let me tell you one thing that we do in the co-op world that is specific to trying to attract and retain people for the long term. We still have a really strong, actuarially sound, defined benefit pension plan for electric cooperative employees. On top of that, we have a 401k plan as well. We try to create those economic incentives for those long-term employees, the people who stay in the job, that there's really that broader economic value for retirement as well. We find that that's allowed us to maintain and hold line workers for long times at our different co-ops. And that's just another factor that we found is helpful for our retaining that workforce.
And are those programs, the 401k and the defined pension plans, are those services that you provide as an association to your members so that each one doesn't have to go out and figure it out on their own?
That is correct. We offer that through the National Association. That's why we're from an employee base, we're one of the largest associations in the country because we manage the 401k and the defined benefit plan. We also, quite candidly, offer group health insurance for all of our co-ops across the country too. So we run a lot of those employee benefits out of this National Association. Allows us to do it in a more economic way. We run them at cost. We do not make one penny of margin on that. We try to do it in as lean a way as we can, but we also, I just have to say, run them in a very actuarially sound way so that they have a solid future ahead.
I think that's so important for the audience to understand that your members are small cooperatives that couldn't economically run these kind of programs, and that the association provides this benefit to them at an efficient cost. One last question, if we've got a couple more minutes. You mentioned the importance of policymakers taking into consideration reliability as we go through this energy transition, and we're going to see a lot of new technologies deployed on the grid. We're going to be seeing the grid called upon for new services. How does that play out for your members? What are some of the reliability considerations they're worried about, and what are you looking to do to help them?
Sure, great question. First of all, we are concerned about having that always available dispatchable power, or in other words, do we have baseload power that's going to be there 24/7? That's sort of foundational to the way the grid's structured today. It's going to be foundational however we restructure the grid in the future as well. And we are concerned about that in terms of the weather events we've seen and times when the always available dispatch resource, or the non-dispatch resource, excuse me, the intermittent resources aren't available. Secondly, I mentioned the concern about gas supply and the infrastructure in this country during those cold weather events having the capacity to deliver that gas when we really need it to make electricity. We've seen some stumbles in that regard in the past year where we had challenges in that regard. And finally, I think that if you're going to shift the action to more of a distributed area, and you're going to put new electric loads on, like electric vehicles with intermittent rapid charging, most of our members are at the distribution level. They're not doing high voltage transmission line. In fact, the vast majority of the electric cooperatives are purely in the distribution business. And I think policy has often looked at the grid from a transmission only perspective, and transmission is still going to be really an important part of the grid, right? But there are a whole series of issues now that we weren't necessarily thinking about of the old model, that in its energy transition, there are new challenges, new demands, new requirements that are going to be placed on the distribution side of our electric grid. And since the co-ops are so much a distribution oriented set of utilities, that's really top of mind for us. So those are the conversations we want to have with the policymakers. By the way, I'm not saying this is a big problem. There's technology and solutions to make it work. We just need to be thoughtful about making sure we do that at the front end. That's the key. It's going to be different than it was before, but the good news is we've got options to make it work.
Reliability is paramount. Jim, I always appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I learn a lot every year when we have this chat. I look forward to you coming back and briefing us next year on all the things that you're doing to bring electricity to the heartland.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Will. Appreciate the opportunity.